Hi, my name is Matthew McQuilla. I am a graduate of Pennsylvania State University's Masters of International Affairs. I'm with Larry Cotta Backer. I am his graduate assistant, and today we will be having a conversation slash interview about his upcoming book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Well, just fine. A little nervous. It's going to be very interesting since I do not know the questions you're going to ask me. And it's going to be kind of fun to get it from questions from a fresh and young perspective, but also fairly causing me a little bit of nervousness, but I'm ready to go.
I'm sure there shouldn't be any reason for nervousness seeing that you wrote the book and you have all the answers to the test.
Yeah, but I know you. I know you.
Well, let's start off with an easy question. Today, this section will be about the preface of the book. So, more than anything, and I have read the book already, so I can speak,
Hey,
I can speak from that perspective. But the first thing is, can you just introduce yourself to those who are listening to this?
all right. Well, very short introduction because you put me on the spot, Matthew, since I hate talking about myself.
Oh,
Um,
really?
I just hate it. Larry Cottabacker. I am on the faculty at both the School of International Affairs and the law school. I've been working on issues related to China for a long time, especially from the perspective of theory, especially Marxist-Leninist theory, and in a comparative way as well, looking at the development both within the historical context of China and then within the larger context of the development of principles and norms that are coming out of the now almost two generations long effort to develop kind of global norms through our structures of globalization, and then the conversations that they would have with liberal democratic systems. And all of this kind of now coalesces for me in the context of the series of extraordinary events which began, and actually today we're doing the interview on the second anniversary of the beginning of the protests that occurred on June 9th, 2019. So I do a little bit of work on Chinese political theory. I do a lot of work in semiotics, the meaning, the way in which communities come together and develop meanings and ways of looking at the world around them. And that also informed a lot of the way in which I approached the history, the quite intense history of events in Hong Kong between 2019 and 2020. So I've got a number of books on issues of semiotics, on issues of meaning, and on issues involving both discourse, meaning structures, implications and operations of political and political economic systems, which is more than I wanted to say, but there you go. You asked.
So, because you've written many books, you definitely understand the investment that it takes, whether it be energy, time, money, in creating a book. What drove you to tell this specific story?
Well, it's in a way, and I was going to mention this before. One of the more interesting things for me about this is there not so much the implications, but the echoes. Some of which has touched my own history. Our family uh, emigrated from Cuba to the United States after the revolution there, and so we've had a lifelong connection with an interest in the way in which these kinds of systems work. And I've spent a bit of time, and I should have mentioned this before, looking at, in fact, the genesis of what is now the modern Marxist-Leninist system in Cuba as well. And so for me, places where there are meeting points between developing Marxist-Leninist states and their interactions and sometimes their confrontations with liberal democratic states, and sometimes in places where they're trying to sort of not so much get together, but to try to figure out how they manage relations among each other have tended to really pique my interest. And so that's part of what I'm looking at. But anyway, your question, if you can repeat it again.
My question was to see what kind of got you to invest the time and energy into writing this specific story between.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. It was the investment part that I missed, and it's this alignment. Plus, of course, my interest was really piqued because I happened to be these are my pictures, by the way, in the background. I happened to be in Hong Kong on the 9th of June, 2019, and I had been there earlier. I'd been going to Hong Kong for quite a number of years. And I'd been there for the last major set of this kind of public eruption, this kind of public discursive, this physical discursive. I'm using uh, jargon, and I'm sorry about that. The way in which people express their adherence to or their desires for particular principles or ways of acting or being, or the ways in which they view their systems ought to be set up physically on the street, as opposed to doing something like I just did, which is to write a 400-page book. They were actually out on the street, and it was just, it was extraordinary. And so all of these things kind of converged, and I started following the events starting on the 9th of June as they kind of developed from the 9th of June. And I ended this study, but I continue to look closely at what is going on in Hong Kong, but all the way to the enactment and the initial efforts to enforce the national anthem law, and of course now much more prominently the national security law for Hong Kong, which takes us from the beginning, which is the manifestation of a one set of popular sentiments about what Hong Kong is and what they think it ought to be and where it ought to go, and their frustration with the way in which they thought both local and national authorities were going, to its ending, where in fact local national authorities with another group of Hong Kong people elaborated a very different vision for Hong Kong, which is a vision that is now being developed, to the consternation of the significant elements of both the liberal democratic camp and in particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, and to some extent causing some conflict or some interactions with the way in which people outside of the Marxist-Leninist camp and outside of Hong Kong were looking at the event. So that sort of, and for me, all of that just became such a rich story. I had no idea how it was going to end. But it became such a rich story. You've got popular manifestations, you've got local authorities and national authorities, you've got um, really quite complicated issues of autonomy, of constitutional norms, of collective coherence, operating on multiple levels, the local, the national, the international, all working in the same spot, and seeing it develop actually quite methodically over the course and very passionately over the course of a year was just extraordinary. And the essays kind of reflect that. So this isn't a book or a series of essays that were written after the fact. It really is, it's a combination of deep analytics, but analytics tied to particular points in time when they were written. So it's like a diary of the historical development of these interactions that occur in Hong Kong between 2019 and 2020 as the events occur. And then, so as you follow through it, you watch me go, oh, wow, this is happening now. Maybe this is the way it's going to spin out, to, oh my God, I didn't realize this was going to happen. It kind of reframes things to the end, which is, wow, did I see this coming? Did I not see this coming? What does it all mean? Although you have to read the book to see whether indeed I saw it coming or not.
Did that alter any of the editing processes because you were writing it in the moment? Were you able to go back and maybe alter some of the perspectives made maybe in June of 2019 when you were sitting back in June of 2020 looking at it?
Oh my God, you see my hands? I was itching. And that was actually the hardest part of writing this book, because the essays were done in raw form at the time. And so a lot of the writing, quote unquote, and editing of the materials was to move it from a raw to a finished state. And of course, you can imagine, and in fact, you can do more than imagine, since you and I were wrestling with this over the course of many months, the temptation to then go back and rewrite, given what you know, was very strong. But I did my best not to do that. Occasionally you will see, I'll drop some kind of foreshadowing, and you'll see it in the footnotes. But I did my best, and you can tell me whether you think it kind of worked, to keep it in the perspective, including perspectives that wound up maybe not panning out, in the perspective, given what I knew, what everyone kind of knew, and what was going around, in terms of people communicating at the time that the essays were written. So there's a little bit of a story, and so in that sense, it's very different from a traditional or orthodox academic analytical work. It also reads like the story of the events. For some groups and some people, a tragedy; for some groups and some people, a victorious vindication of their own perspective, and for other people, not clear. But there's all of that.
So when reading this, I'm sure that many different people will be reading this around the world. Of course, you hope. But
Yeah, there's news
we
behind the book.
absolutely. And so we all have the guilty pleasure. Most of us have the guilty pleasure of allowing our own perspectives to interfere with how we read something, forcing us to read it in different languages almost that are incompatible with one another. And those are the topics we'll probably touch on later as we continue doing these interviews. What perspective or angle were you writing this book from?
Okay, thank you. That was actually not only keeping my hands off the computer to kind of modernize the essays was a challenge, but the other challenge was precisely the one that you mentioned. Hong Kong, like a lot of meeting points or explosion points in the conversations that have been ongoing, and in a much more intense way over the last 5 or 6 years, between liberal democratic and Marxist Leninist systems, between nationalist and supranationalist or internationalist perspectives, have really created a very significant and very deep set of passions, and a sense of a need to be loyal to express a fidelity with one or another of the systems. And my aim in this book, and of course you can never do it completely. You can try to be out, but there's always, it's never possible to do it completely successfully. Hopefully I was successful enough, was to try to look at what I was looking at in each of the chapters strictly from the, as close as I can get to the perspective of the object of analysis, so that I tried very hard not to take a perspective that suggested that the book adhered to the particular view, the normative outlook, or the principles of one of the major protagonists, but indeed took each of them as on their own terms, and then tried to look at it from that perspective, and then looked at how those quite distinct but quite well developed, and for each of the groups quite legitimate and authoritative ways of looking at the world, caused a number of problems. One of them was the way in which that produced this almost inevitable inability of people to communicate with each other. And so you'd see, and you saw this, we had discussions about this as I was writing the book. People would be using the same words or the same phrases and they mean completely different things. They'd understand this at a basic, at a normative level in very different ways. The way in which they viewed the landscape would be based in a sense on where they started from. And for a lot of the significant protagonists, those views were irreconcilable. The second thing, of course, is that when you took those, when you take those views as given and you analyze it out, then the inevitability of the particular positions of the protagonists, the United States, the UK, the international community, the central authorities in Beijing, the local authorities, the protesters, the academic community in Hong Kong. Also, then you begin to understand both the constraints and the inevitability of the positions and where they wound up going to. And that is actually what made the book really fascinating, because in a sense, you're not looking at history in terms of dates, you're looking at the way 3 or 4 or 5 sets of principal protagonists, it's kind of like a Greek tragedy, followed naturally their own principles, outlooks, the things that made them who they are, and in a sense then constrain them in the way in which they confronted people who were in antagonistic positions and limited the way in which they could relate to them. And hopefully at the end of this, it will be clear that there are no favorites in the way I wrote the book. There are merely people doing and collectives doing what collectives are doing. And hopefully by the end of this, the reader will have a much better sense of where everyone was coming from and why what they did, for good or ill, depending on the perspective that you bring in yourself, occurs.
Okay, understandable. And I'm sure people will formulate their own perspectives and um, will decide who was good, who was bad, if they decide anyone was good or bad. But that's what you left for the reader to decide in some ways.
Right, right, right. And I should underline that, and I'm glad you brought that out. Right. So there's, I I don't start nor do I end the book by choosing good or bad, winners or losers. What I do is I see a field populated by people who believe both in the rightness of what they're doing and inevitably in the error of what their antagonists are doing. You put them all in a very small place that has a lot of people and a huge and hugely complicated history. And then you set off a series of events that then move them towards making decisions and interacting in ways that then produces both the protests at the beginning of June of 2019, and then inevitably the enactment of the national anthem law and the national security law and its enforcement starting a year later in June 2020 when my chronicle ends.
So that's where I want to start. I want to talk about the beginning. I want to talk about the genesis of this. I want to talk about June 2019. I just want you to tell me, you talked about the effect it had on you to write this book, but give me your perspective on June 9th, where you were, how you felt, and allow the viewers to understand what you saw that drove you to write this book on June 2019.
Well, that is actually a very easy question, and I can finally answer a question without using like 4,000 words. The answer to your question is your background. That was a picture that I took that day in 2019. That's what I saw, and that's what moved me. And if you look carefully at the picture, it kind of it suggests the fundamental semiotic perspective, that is the way in which objects are signified, the way in which meaning can be extracted from images, from words, from approaches. that mark a lot of what's going on in the book, as well as the strategic implications given the normative starting points of people. That's what I saw. And it was for me extraordinarily moving, not necessarily in a, wow, this is fabulous and great, and we're moving towards this thing, moving as in looking at this, understanding that whatever happened after this, I was witnessing something that was going to be important. How important, I had no idea. A small blip, a big blip. And on June 9th, I could not have possibly predicted anything that was going on. And of course, depending on who I talked to, the vision of the end game of this was going to be diametrically different among the principal protagonists. I can talk to Westerners, especially Americans or Brits, and they would spin this out in one direction. I could talk to protesters, and there were a number of different, it wasn't a unified group, of course. There were a number of people who'd all come together because they shared at least a big enough area of common concern that they could come together. They would spin this out slightly differently. You talk to local, or certainly central authority people, or people sympathetic to them, and it was completely different. So, and everyone was spinning this stuff out in very different ways, but that picture really explains not only why I was moved, but also the perspective that I wound up adopting. If you look, I'm on a pedestrian bridge over the street where many of the protesters were marching, but and you look at the marchers and you go, okay, so the focus is going to be on the protest. But if you look carefully at that picture, you notice where I focus. It wasn't necessarily on the marchers, the mass of people whose, and it's not even a word, whose massivity, the girth of which was itself an extraordinary thing. There is singularity made up of hundreds of thousands of people that have now come together. The whole basis of the notion of collectivity is a physical presence there on the street, which of course was extraordinary. You don't see that all that often, at least in this way. But if you look at the picture, what stands in the foreground is not the many people who have come together as one to manifest, to make concrete a set of abstract ideas that they hold very strongly, but it's the people who are standing on the bridge with cameras, observing, and very different kinds of people. And so when you look at this, you go, oh, wow. So you've got the protest, but who here, what animates this, what gives it meaning, what ultimately will signify it and then have significant consequences is not necessarily just the people on the street, but it's the people on the bridge who are looking, who are taking pictures, who are remembering, who are memorializing, who are reporting, who are thinking about, and who may then react or respond to it. And so there's an interaction here, an extraordinary interaction. And that, for me in June, that's what I saw. It wasn't just an event, you know, the way you have a laser light show or something and you go, oh, wow, that was great theater. This was much more than theater. It was clear that something was being turned on, and it wasn't merely a manifestation of the protesters, but it was going to be this manifestation from a variety of different perspectives, standing in different places, individuated, collectivized, there, not there. And so for me, that was like, oh, wow, this is really worth looking, especially given the nature of the context in which all of this was occurring.
Okay.
One in which you have China, Chinese sovereignty, Hong Kong autonomy. You have international agreements that may or may not have been operative or operative in particular ways. And then the interests of the international community also heavily represented there, you know, all coming together. And I go, wow, let's see where this goes. So that's kind of like the answers. It's the picture behind you.
Okay. Yeah. Then, well, what are the odds? the final question I wanted to ask you originally was going to be, um, what made you want to write this book in this format? But I feel as though we may have already touched on that. And so I'll alter the question and say, for those who may critique this book, a critic may say, this format doesn't really teach a lesson. This they may not view this as a large enough event to draw many lessons from, and may critique it in that way. How would you respond to someone that doubts the lessons that can be taught in a book that is written like this, where it is almost purely observation in the moment, and then more so hindsight as the book goes on? How would you respond to that?
Oh, there's a naughty way and a nice way to
Well,
respond.
let's be nice here because people are watching.
Look, everyone, when people wrestle with text, and in this case, assuming that they are open enough or interested enough to want to read this, one always, no matter what an author does to try to embed a text with meaning, that is lessons, objectives, or the like, it will really be the reader herself or themselves or himself that will, from their own perspective, and their willingness to be open and read through the text, to be able to come to some sort of enlightenment, some insight. So there's no lesson here. There are insights that I try to extract, right? And in that context, right, it's not a mere chronicle. A lot of this goes back to the essence of thinking about rhetoric and discourse, going back to the earliest Chinese texts on rhetoric. A lot of this goes back to Western notions of meaning making and its instability. And so as you read this, each one of these essays, in a sense, is an invitation not only to probe down deeper, but to look at the nature of the discourse and its meaning and what is being constructed that occurs within the context, the temporal context and the physical context, at the time in which the essay was written. And when you put it all together, there are, I think, I hope, not so much lessons to be drawn. This isn't a cookbook, as much as I wish I could do that. People would read it in 10 seconds, come up with whatever ridiculous lesson or objective that I might want to peddle, and then go off and it'll have a half-life of 5 minutes. I tried for something a little more ambitious than that, and that is to draw more profound insights about the nature of engagement, discursive engagements like this across very different ways of looking at the world, and what that tells us about the way in which humans invest meaning in themselves, in their communities, across communities, the way collectives both see and act in the world. And those insights may be useful not only in understanding both the complexities, tragedies, and triumphs of Hong Kong, but may provide some insights into similar sorts of engagements, conflicts, conversations, developments that are occurring elsewhere.
Okay. Well,
At the end of the day, though, and I should underline this, at the end of the day, there's no winning team or losing team. And hopefully by the end of this, no matter what your perspective, your political perspective is, there'll be enough here to make you think about that perspective. I'm not asking anyone to change their views. If you come to this book as a committed Marxist-Leninist or as a committed member of a human rights privileging a liberal democratic order, I certainly am the last person on earth to tell you read this book and your life will be transformed. Quite the reverse. But to the extent I can deepen your own sense of where you think you are, to allow you to expand your view, to kind of lift your gaze a little and see the way the rest of the world in which you engage your own profoundly and deeply held beliefs are, then in that respect, maybe the book will do some good.
Okay, well, that was the last question that I had. And if you would like to add anything else, I'm sure that might have summed it up the best. But would you like to add anything else uh, to help people better understand the preface of this book?
No, just a very short note to say that the preface is meant to lay out essentially what Matthew and I have been talking about these last 15 or 20 minutes or so. It does it in a little more detail, provides readers who are less knowledgeable about Hong Kong with enough of its context so that the essays can be richly mined to the extent that the reader wants to, and then lays out in some detail the organization of the book and the essays. The essays are divided into 6 parts that start in June 2019 and then in June 2020. I should mention that the preface is available. You don't have to buy the book to read the preface. The preface is available free on the website of Little Sir Press, and I'm happy to make that available. You can go to my blog, Law at the End of the Day, and the links will be there. And then over the course of the next little bit of time, we'll be talking about each of the chapters, hopefully in 15-minute segments or so, leading up to, and this is shameless self-promotion, but I figured I'd do this, leading up to the book launch event, which will be a webinar that we will be hosting and Matthew will be organizing. So again, thank you, on the 13th of July of this year. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. And as always, a challenging set of very subtle questions. So thank you very much.
Flattery will get you nowhere, Professor Backer.
All right.
All right, well, I'm glad we were able to do this chapter, and I hope you all will be on the lookout for chapter 1, 2, and 3 as they come later this week.
All right. Thank you.